In the dim light of a quiet old house, Nicholas Wade, a lonely widower, begins writing letters to his beloved late wife, Margaret. Every night he pours his grief into ink, placing the letters in a box he once called her memory chest. One morning, a letter returns, written in an unfamiliar, trembling hand. "I miss you too, Nicholas," it begins, but as the days pass, the letters grow darker, revealing chilling secrets about Margaret's death and warnings of something sinister closing in. Nicholas Wade had never been fond of silence, but it was all that remained after Margaret passed. His once lively home had turned into a mausoleum of memories, where every creak echoed her absence. Days turned into weeks, and the ache in his chest never dulled. Their bedroom became unbearable. Instead, he lingered in the sitting room, surrounded by relics of their life together, a faded wedding photo, a stopped clock Margaret loved, and her memory chest. The chest had always fascinated Nicholas. Margaret had kept it locked, its contents a mystery he had never pressed to uncover. Now it sat in the corner, quiet and imposing, as though waiting. One late autumn evening, overwhelmed by the oppressive quiet, Nicholas sat by the fire and stared at the empty chair across from him. He missed her voice, her laugh, her soft hums as she cooked. The loneliness pressed down on him, heavier than ever. That was the night he decided to write. If he couldn't hear Margaret's voice, he would speak to her instead. Fetching a pen and paper, he began, "My dearest Margaret." The words felt alien and familiar all at once. He paused, struggling to express the grief and emptiness that consumed him. Finally, he wrote, "The house is so quiet without you. I miss you every day. I keep thinking I'll turn a corner and see you there, smiling at me. I don't know if I'll ever stop wishing for that." Tears blurred his vision as he folded the letter. For a moment he hesitated, unsure what to do with it. Then he remembered the memory chest. It had been Margaret's sanctuary, the place where she stored her most cherished things. Perhaps it could be his, too. Unlocking it with the brass key from her jewelry box, he discovered pressed flowers, postcards, and even a lock of their son's baby hair. With trembling hands, he placed the letter on top and closed the lid. The act of writing brought Nicholas a strange kind of solace. For the first time in months, he felt as though he had reached across the void and touched Margaret, however fleetingly. The next evening, he wrote again. And so, it became his nightly ritual. By firelight, he poured his heart onto the page, telling her about his day, the changing leaves, and the fleeting moments of joy and sadness. At first, the writing was an act of catharsis, a way to relieve the weight of his loneliness. He wrote about the mundane details of his day, the cold wind that rattled the windows, the neighbor's dog barking in the early hours, the meals he ate alone at the kitchen table. Yet, as time went on, the letters became more. Nicholas found himself confessing things he had never dared to say aloud, how he had taken Margaret's quiet strength for granted, how he regretted every argument over trivial matters, how he... Each letter became more heartfelt than the last. He poured into them the words he'd never managed to say during their years together. He told her how proud he was of the life they had built, of the family they had raised. He apologized for the moments he had failed her and shared memories he feared he might someday forget, the way she laughed when the rain ruined their picnic, the warmth of her hand on his arm as they walked through crowded streets. Then, one morning, everything changed. Nicholas awoke to find an envelope on the sitting room table. His heart stopped. It was the same kind of envelope he used for his letters, but he hadn't left it there. Trembling, he turned it over. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was Margaret's. His breath quickened. It wasn't possible. Margaret was gone. Yet there it was, the delicate loops and flourishes he had admired for decades. With shaking hands, he opened the envelope. "Nicholas," it began, "I miss you too." He read and reread the letter, tears flowing freely. How was this possible? It felt like a miracle, a gift from beyond the grave. That night he wrote back with more passion than ever, pouring every emotion he had held back since her passing. He placed the letter in the chest, his heart filled with wonder and hope. The next morning, another letter awaited him. Margaret's words were warm, familiar, describing how she watched over him and missed their time together. Nicholas felt as though his prayers had been answered. But over the next few days, the tone of the letters began to shift. Margaret's words grew somber, her phrasing cryptic. "I'm sorry I left you," one letter read, "but there are things you don't know, things I couldn't tell you." A chill ran down Nicholas's spine, but he pushed the unease aside. He couldn't let go of this fragile connection to her. Then, one night, as he placed another letter in the chest, he noticed something strange. The air around the chest seemed colder, heavier, like an unseen weight pressing on him. When he closed the lid, he thought he heard a faint whisper. "Nicholas!" He froze. The room was silent, the kind of silence that pressed against his ears like a weight. His heart pounded, and he felt the hairs on his arms rise. Shaking his head, he dismissed it as exhaustion. He hadn't been sleeping well since the letters began. But deep down, Nicholas knew something had changed. The memory chest no longer felt like a vessel for his love. It felt like something else entirely. And as he stared at it that night, he couldn't shake the feeling that it was staring back. Nicholas couldn't stop thinking about the letters. Each morning, he woke with anticipation and dread, eager to see if another had appeared, yet terrified of what it might contain. The letters became his lifeline, a connection to Margaret that he never thought possible. But with each new letter, the unease that simmered in the background grew stronger. Something about the tone of her words. It was still Margaret, but it wasn't quite the same. One letter haunted him more than the others. "Do you remember the garden?" it asked. "That's where I tried to protect us." Nicholas stared at the words, his heart pounding. The garden had been Margaret's sanctuary, a place she had tended with devotion. Roses, lavender, and peonies had once flourished under her care, but after her passing, it had grown wild and overgrown, as though mourning her absence. Unable to shake the feeling that the letter was urging him to do something, Nicholas ventured into the garden for the first time in months. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, and the once beautiful flower beds were now choked with weeds. As he wandered through the tangled paths, he couldn't help but feel as though he were being watched. The sensation was faint at first, like the weight of unseen eyes on the back of his neck, but it grew stronger the deeper he went. Near the center of the garden, he found something unusual, a patch of disturbed soil as though someone had dug there recently. His breath hitched. Margaret had loved this part of the garden most, where she had planted lilies. But now there were no flowers, only the scarred earth. The letter's words echoed in his mind. "That's where I tried to protect us." With trembling hands, Nicholas fetched a shovel from the shed and began to dig. The soil was loose, giving way easily beneath the blade, and it wasn't long before he struck something solid. His heart pounded as he unearthed an old tin box, rusted and weathered. It looked like it had been buried for years. He hesitated before opening it, a deep sense of foreboding settling over him. But curiosity, and something deeper, perhaps the need for answers, won out. Inside, he found a collection of items that made his stomach churn. A pair of leather gloves, stained and torn, a small bundle of letters bound with twine, and an old photograph of a man he didn't recognize, his face partially obscured by a shadow. Nicholas's hands shook as he unfolded one of the letters. The handwriting wasn't Margaret's. It was sharp and jagged, the ink smudged in places as though written in haste. The words sent a chill through him. "I know what you've done, and you can't hide it forever." His mind raced. Who had written this, and who was it meant for? He rifled through the remaining letters, but they only deepened the mystery. They spoke of betrayal, secrets, and guilt, things that didn't align with the Margaret he had known. Yet the presence of these items in their garden suggested she had known more than she had ever let on. That night, he couldn't sleep. The chest in the sitting room seemed to hum with an almost imperceptible energy, and he found himself staring at it from across the room, the tin box now sitting beside it. The words from the last letter burned in his mind. "You can't hide it forever." Against his better judgment, Nicholas wrote another letter to Margaret, asking her directly about the box. What is this? Who was that man? Why were these things buried in the garden? He placed the letter in the chest and waited, his heart hammering in his chest. Sleep eluded him as he sat in the armchair by the fire, his gaze locked on the chest. When he finally drifted into a fitful sleep, he was awoken by a sound, a faint rustling, like paper being moved. The chest was open. The letter he had written was gone. In its place was another envelope, Margaret's familiar handwriting scrawled across it. His hands trembled as he opened it. "Nicholas," it began, "I never wanted you to find it." The words that followed were fragmented and disjointed, as though written in a rush. She spoke of a choice she had made, of something she had tried to bury to protect their family. "He wouldn't stop," one line read. "I had no other choice." Nicholas's heart raced. Who was he? And what had Margaret done? The more he read, the less he understood. The letter ended abruptly with a single chilling line. "He's still watching." The room felt colder than before. The fire in the hearth reduced to smoldering embers. Nicholas glanced at the chest and the tin box beside it, the weight of the secrets they contained pressing down on him. For the first time since Margaret's passing, he felt truly afraid, not just of losing her, but of what she might have left behind. As dawn broke, Nicholas stood in the garden once more, staring at the disturbed patch of soil. The shadows seemed longer, darker, and the once familiar space now felt alien. He realized then that the letters were not just a connection to Margaret. They were pulling him into something deeper, something darker. And whatever it wasn't finished with him yet. Nicholas barely recognized the man in the mirror. Dark circles hung under his eyes, and his hands trembled when he gripped the sink. Sleep had become a stranger, slipping away as the weight of the letters pressed down on him. The house felt colder now, even in the glow of the firelight. Shadows danced in corners where no light should have been, and whispers brushed his ears when no one was there. The garden had become a place of dread. Every time Nicholas glanced out the window, he felt its pull, as though the tangled weeds and disturbed soil were calling him back. He avoided stepping outside, but the memories of what he unearthed in the tin box lingered. The gloves, the photograph, the cryptic letters, they had to mean something. Margaret had hidden them for a reason, but Nicholas couldn't guess what it was. Another letter came the next morning, its arrival as inevitable as the sunrise. This time, Margaret's words were sharper, more urgent. "You need to leave the house," she wrote. "It's not safe anymore. He's watching you." Nicholas's breath caught. He stared at the words, hoping they would somehow rearrange themselves into something less terrifying. But they didn't. The message was clear. Determined to understand, Nicholas returned to the chest. He pulled out the tin box and spread its contents on the coffee table, examining each item. The photograph of the shadowed man drew his attention most. There was something unsettling about it, though he couldn't say why. The man's features were obscured, but his posture, it suggested he was watching someone. Watching them. A knock at the door shattered the silence, making Nicholas flinch. He wasn't expecting anyone, and visitors had become rare since Margaret's passing. With hesitation, he opened the door to find a man in a long coat standing on the porch. His face was lined with age, and his eyes were sharp, studying Nicholas with curiosity and suspicion. "Mr. Wade," the man asked, his voice low and even. "My name is Richard Marlowe. I'm a private investigator." Nicholas hesitated. "I don't understand. Why are you here?" Marlowe glanced past Nicholas into the house, his gaze lingering on the sitting room. "I've been looking into some Old cases, and your wife's name came up. I was hoping we could talk." Nicholas's heart sank. The tin box flashed through his mind. What kind of cases? Marlowe stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. "Disappearance cases," he said simply. "There's a man, James Harker. He vanished 20 years ago. Worked as a handyman in this area. Did some work on your house, if I'm not mistaken." The photograph. Nicholas's stomach churned. "I don't know anything about that," he said quickly, too quickly. Marlowe raised an eyebrow but didn't press. Instead, he glanced at the coffee table where the contents of the tin box were spread out. His expression darkened. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward the items. Reluctantly, Nicholas nodded. Marlowe picked up the photograph, studying it intently. "This is him," he said after a moment. "James Harker." Nicholas felt the blood drain from his face. "That's not possible. I've never seen this man before." Marlowe's gaze hardened. "Are you sure? Because this photograph was taken here. That's your garden in the background." Nicholas's legs felt like they might give out. He sank into the armchair, his mind racing. How could this be? Margaret had buried these things, hidden them away. But why? "Mr. Wade," Marlowe continued, "I followed this case for years, and it's led me to believe James Harker didn't just vanish. I think something happened to him, and your wife knew what it was." Nicholas's hands tightened on the arms of the chair. "You're saying Margaret had something to do with this?" "I'm saying she knew more than she let on," Marlowe replied, "and someone else knows too, someone who doesn't want the truth coming out." The room felt suffocating. Nicholas's gaze darted to the chest, then back to Marlowe. "What am I supposed to do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Marlowe set the photograph down and looked Nicholas square in the eye. "If I were you, I'd leave. This house, it's not safe, and neither are you." After Marlowe left, Nicholas sat in silence, his thoughts a chaotic swirl. The investigator's words echoed in his mind, mingling with Margaret's warnings. "He's watching you." The house felt alive in a way it hadn't before, its walls closing in around him. That night, another letter appeared. This one was different. The handwriting was erratic, almost frantic. "Don't trust him," it read. "He's not who he says he is." Nicholas stared at the words, confusion and fear warring within him. Marlowe's visit had been unsettling, but he hadn't given any reason to distrust him. Yet Margaret's warning was clear. He sat by the fire, the letter in his trembling hands, and wondered who or what he could believe. The whispers returned that night, louder now, more insistent, like a chorus of voices just out of reach. Nicholas pressed his hands to his ears, but it didn't help. The whispers weren't coming from outside. They were coming from the house, from the chest. He glanced at the photograph of James Harker, now lying face up on the coffee table. For the briefest moment, he thought he saw the shadowed figure move. Nicholas closed his eyes, but the image burned in his mind. He realized then that the letters, the chest, the garden, they were all part of something much bigger than Margaret's secrets. And he was caught in the middle of it. Nicholas sat by the fire that evening, the chest looming in the shadows of the sitting room like a silent predator. The house felt impossibly quiet, and yet he could hear faint noises, whispers threading through the silence, just loud enough to unsettle him. He clutched the latest letter in his hands. Don't trust him. He's not who he says he is. Marlowe's arrival had been abrupt, unsettling, and though the investigator had explanations, Margaret's warnings couldn't be ignored. Who was Marlowe? Could he be trusted? Nicholas's gaze shifted to the photograph of the man, still lying on the coffee table. The figure in the photo seemed to stare back, accusing and unrelenting. Determined to find clarity, Nicholas decided he couldn't sit idly any longer. He needed answers, even if it meant uncovering truths he wasn't ready to face. With trembling hands, he opened the tin box and sifted through the items inside. Each object felt heavier than it should, as though carrying the weight of untold stories. The gloves, stained and torn, seemed particularly haunting, and he couldn't shake the feeling they had been used for something terrible. This time, he turned his attention to the letters bound with twine. The handwriting was jagged, uneven, a stark contrast to Margaret's familiar loops and curves. Untying the bundle, a chill swept through the room, making the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. He unfolded the first letter and began to read. "Margaret," it began, "you can't hide this forever. People will come asking questions. I've done my part to keep things quiet, but my patience is thin. If this gets out, it'll destroy everything." Nicholas's hands trembled. It was signed with a single initial, J. Was this James Harker? And if so, what was he accusing Margaret of hiding? The letter was vague but threatening, dripping with implications of something horribly wrong. The remaining letters painted a picture of blackmail, of someone desperate to keep a secret buried. But who was being blackmailed? Margaret or James? Margaret had always been forthright, a pillar of integrity. Or had she? Nicholas felt a pang of guilt for questioning her, but the evidence in front of him was impossible to ignore. The sound of breaking glass jolted Nicholas from his thoughts. He jumped to his feet, heart hammering. The noise had come from the kitchen. Grabbing the fireplace poker for protection, he crept toward the sound. The whispers grew louder with each step, though indistinct, like voices just beyond comprehension. When he reached the kitchen, he found the window shattered, shards of glass glittering on the floor like frost. The night air howled through the opening, carrying with it the faint scent of earth and decay. Nicholas's eyes darted around, searching for any sign of an intruder, but there was nothing. The whispers, however, persisted, wrapping around him like fog. Then he saw it, a piece of paper fluttering on the table, held down by a shard of glass. His stomach turned as he recognized the handwriting. It was Margaret's. "Nicholas," the letter read, "you're running out of time. He's already here." Nicholas staggered back, the poker clattering to the floor. How could he protect himself from an enemy he couldn't even see? The walls of the house seemed to close in, and the whispers grew louder, almost deafening. In a panic, Nicholas fled to the sitting room and threw open the chest. The letters, the gloves, the photograph, he needed to understand them before it was too late. But as he stared into the chest, he realized something was wrong. The photograph of James Harker was gone. The room grew colder, and the shadows deepened, pressing in from all sides. Nicholas spun around, breath shallow. The whispers were no longer distant. They were in the room with him, surrounding him. A shadow moved in the corner of his vision, and he whipped around to face it, but there was nothing. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice shaking. The only response was the whispering, which now carried a sinister edge, like mocking laughter beneath the surface. Desperation overtook him. Nicholas grabbed the letters and began to burn them in the fireplace one by one. The flames devoured the paper, and for a moment, the whispers seemed to falter. But as the last letter burned, the room erupted in a cacophony of noise, a deafening roar of voices, each one more anguished than the last. Nicholas fell to his knees, clutching his head. "What do you want from me?" he screamed, his voice swallowed by the chaos. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. The room was silent once more, the fire casting flickering shadows on the walls. Nicholas sat trembling on the floor, the weight of the night crushing him. He didn't know what to believe anymore, whether Margaret was trying to protect him or had drawn him into something far darker. The chest sat open beside him, its contents still holding their secrets. Nicholas knew he couldn't leave now, not without answers. But as he stared into the flames, he couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching him, waiting for his next move. The whispers no longer stopped, even in daylight. Nicholas could barely think as they filled every corner of the house, their presence oppressive as a fog. They were louder now, distinct voices overlapping, their words elusive but undeniable. Sometimes he thought he could hear his name, spoken in a tone both pleading and accusing. The chest remained open in the sitting room, its contents untouched, but Nicholas couldn't bring himself to examine it again. He hadn't slept in days, and the toll was evident. His hands trembled, his vision blurred. The house, once a sanctuary, had become a prison. Yet he couldn't leave. The letters and the secrets buried in the tin box. They held answers he needed. That morning, Nicholas sat at the kitchen table, staring at the shattered window. The wind outside carried the scent of rain, but the air inside was thick, suffocating. Another letter had appeared on the table overnight. The handwriting was Margaret's, as always. "Nicholas," it read, "you're so close, but you have to listen. He won't let you go unless you end this." Nicholas clenched his fists. Who was he? James Harker? Marlowe? Or something worse? He read the letter again, hoping for clarity, but found none. Frustration and fear boiled inside him. By afternoon, Nicholas knew he couldn't stay passive. He retrieved the tin box from the chest and carried it into the garden. The overgrown weeds brushed his legs as he reached the patch of disturbed soil. The garden, once Margaret's pride, now felt like a graveyard. He began digging, gripping the shovel with desperation. The soil gave way easily, as though it had been waiting. As he dug deeper, the whispers grew louder. His breath came in ragged gasps, but he didn't stop. The shovel struck something solid. Reaching into the hole, he pulled out another box, larger and heavier than the tin one. It was wooden, its surface scratched and worn. Nicholas hesitated, his heart pounding before prying it open. Inside were photographs, yellowed with age. They showed James Harker, smiling, his arm around Margaret. In some, they were laughing together, standing in the very garden where Nicholas now knelt. The images were a jarring contrast to the shadowed, ominous figure from the tin box. Beneath the photographs was a stack of papers, letters but not written by James or Margaret. The handwriting was unfamiliar, neat, and methodical. Nicholas picked up the top letter and began to read. "To whoever finds this," it began. "If you're reading this, the truth has surfaced. My name is Eleanor Harker, and James was my husband. He went missing 20 years ago, but I've always known Margaret Wade had something to do with it." Nicholas's breath caught. He read on. "James worked for the Wades as a handyman. He came home talking about Margaret, how kind she was, how she reminded him of someone he'd known. I thought nothing of it. But then the letters started. Margaret asked him to meet her in the garden. I warned him to stay away, but he didn't listen." The letter described how James vanished after one such meeting. Eleanor had gone to the authorities, but no evidence tied Margaret to the disappearance. Still, Eleanor was convinced something had happened. Nicholas sifted through the remaining papers. Each detailed Eleanor's suspicions and attempts to uncover the truth. She had even written to Margaret, demanding answers, but received no reply. The whispers were deafening now, their voices merging into a cacophony that made Nicholas's head throb. He clutched his temples, trying to shut them out, but it was no use. The garden pulsed with energy, the weeds swaying despite the still air. "Nicholas!" The voice was clear, cutting through the noise like a blade. It wasn't a whisper. It was Margaret's voice, soft and familiar, but tinged with something Nicholas couldn't identify. He turned, scanning the garden, but saw no one. "Margaret!" he called, his voice breaking. "Is that you?" The air grew colder and the shadows deepened. Nicholas could feel her presence, but it wasn't comforting. It was suffocating. "What happened?" he demanded. "What did you do to James?" The response came in images. Flashes of memory that weren't his own filled his mind. Margaret in the garden with James, her face fearful and determined. James reaching for her, his expression twisted with rage. The sound of a struggle, the feeling of earth beneath her hands as she buried something deep. Nicholas fell to his knees, gasping for air. "No," he whispered, "it's not true. It can't be. But deep down, he knew it was. Margaret had done something terrible, something she had tried to hide, but the house wouldn't let her. And now it had ensnared him, demanding the truth be revealed. The whispers fell silent, leaving Nicholas alone in the garden. The box lay open before him, its contents a testament to the darkness that had consumed Margaret, and now him. As the sun set, Nicholas remained on his knees, staring into the shadows. He knew he couldn't leave, not yet. The house wasn't done with him, and neither was Margaret. The house was no longer a house. It was alive, breathing, watching, waiting. Nicholas could feel it now, its presence seeping into every corner. The whispers had stopped, but the silence was worse. It wasn't empty. It was brimming with tension, like the world itself held its breath. The garden, the chest, the photographs, they all pointed to a single truth. But Nicholas wasn't ready to accept it. He sat in the sitting room, the tin box in front of him. Its contents were scattered across the coffee table. The gloves, the photograph of James Harker, the letters from Eleanor, they whispered of guilt, violence, and secrets he could no longer avoid. Margaret's voice echoed in his mind, her warnings louder with each moment. "He's here, Nicholas. You have to finish this." But finish what? Nicholas clenched his fists. The walls of the house seemed to close in, the flickering firelight casting shadows that moved when they shouldn't. He stared at the letter on the mantel, the paper trembling in the drafty air. He had avoided it all day, too afraid of what it might say, but now, as the silence pressed against him, he couldn't ignore it. He rose and unfolded the paper. The message was brief but chilling. "The truth is in the garden." Nicholas grabbed a lantern and stepped outside. The night was cold, the air biting against his skin. The garden stretched out before him, its once beautiful flowers overrun with weeds, a shadow of Margaret's devotion. He made his way to the patch of disturbed soil where he had dug before. The shovel was still there. He began to dig. The soil was loose as though it had been turned recently. With each scoop, his heart pounded harder. The lantern's light flickered, casting eerie shadows. And then, the shovel hit something solid. Nicholas dropped to his knees and cleared the dirt with his hands. What he uncovered made his stomach churn. It was a wooden box, smaller than the one he had found earlier. The wood was cracked and splintered, and the lock had rusted away. With a deep breath, he pried it open. Inside was a journal. Its leather cover was faded, the edges worn. Nicholas's hands shook as he opened it. The handwriting was unmistakably Margaret's. "My dearest Nicholas," it began. "If you're reading this, then the truth has found its way to you. I hope you can forgive me, but I wouldn't blame you if you couldn't." Tears blurred Nicholas's vision. The journal detailed Margaret's life before she met him, a life he had never known. She wrote of James Harker, of how they had met when she was young, and how he had become obsessed with her. Even after she married Nicholas, he had followed her, sending letters and showing up unannounced. The entries grew darker. Margaret described the night James came to the garden, demanding she leave Nicholas. She refused, and he became violent. In desperation, she struck him with the shovel. The blow had killed him. "I didn't know what else to do," Margaret wrote. "I buried him, hoping it would be the end. But it wasn't. His presence lingered, haunting me and this house. I tried to keep it from you, Nicholas, but I failed. And now he's coming for you." Nicholas closed the journal, trembling. Shadows seemed to move around him, and the silence broke with faint footsteps. "Who's there?" Nicholas called, his voice shaking. He held the journal close as he stood, scanning the darkness. The footsteps grew louder, coming from all around him. And then he saw it, a figure emerging from the shadows. It was James Harker, or what was left of him. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes hollow. He moved slowly, deliberately, his gaze fixed on Nicholas. "You shouldn't have come here," James said, his voice low and raspy. "You shouldn't have dug up the past." Nicholas took a step back, his heart racing. "Stay away," he pleaded. "I didn't do this. It was Margaret." James stopped, tilting his head. "Margaret is gone, but her guilt lives on in you." The ground beneath Nicholas began to shift, the soil churning as though alive. He stumbled, falling to his knees. James loomed over him, his shadow stretching across the garden. "You have to pay for what she did," James said. Nicholas felt the earth pulling him down. He clawed at the ground, trying to free himself, but it was no use. James stood over him, his expression unreadable. "Forgive me," Nicholas whispered, tears streaming. "I didn't know." James knelt down, his face inches from Nicholas's. "It's too late for forgiveness." As James's hollow eyes fixed on him, the darkness consumed Nicholas. The next morning, the garden was quiet once more. The soil was undisturbed, as though nothing had happened. The house stood empty, its secrets buried again. But the whispers remained, waiting for the next soul to uncover the truth,